And we are live on Facebook. Just a small number of participants today. Ian in Portland, Oregon is suffering from food poisoning. Karen's ill. Let me see if I can pull this up. Whoops, the wrong one. No, it wasn't the wrong one. But I can do it a different way. Angelica is, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm not sure why this isn't coming up. She's doing an art exhibit. So that's the poster for her art exhibit. And we have a new member, Brian. I'll just stop sharing. Brian is from Seaham in Northern England. I once lived in York. It was 62 miles from Seaham, about 100 kilometers, but I never went to Seaham. I spent 7 years in the north. I loved it there. I loved the northern lads and the northern people. So he's got a very distinct northern accent. I'll stop sharing. Keith, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Alan. How are you?
Good, thank you. And then Brian from Scottsdale, Arizona. How are you doing, Brian?
Fantastic.
And Hisham is somewhere listening to us. I don't know if he is on his phone, perhaps, and he can say hi or not, but Hisham is coming from Morocco in North Africa. So we've got Europe and North America and Africa right now. And if Angelica was here, we would have South America. So we're international. So this is going to be a very important meeting. But before we begin, Keith, can you just introduce yourself in the context of the Gurdjieff work? When did you first discover the work?
It was in 1990, just by chance, a library book. I was browsing through the library. I found Life is Real, Only When I Am. And then I started to read it and found it too difficult.
Yeah.
And I also found Views from the Real World, which I just sort of devoured. Yeah, it was like really, I related to it. I understood it, and it seemed to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been, you haven't really been members of groups and whatever, have you? Or there's nothing really much up by that part of Northern England. There were more groups in London and Manchester. Karen's joining us. Karen, I understand you're feeling a little under the weather.
I'm not, but my husband's sick, so I'm
okay.
getting up and helping him out with getting things for him.
Okay.
But I'm here.
Okay. How are things?
Glad to meet Keith.
Yeah.
Hi, Keith.
Pleased to meet you, Colin.
Yeah.
Everything's fine here. Weather's beautiful. I hate to tell you that, but
Yeah. Well, we're getting down to around freezing now. I mean, we had a big snowfall a few weeks ago, and normally if it happens in November, the snow is gone the next day, but it stayed for a while. It was quite unusual, but it's almost gone now. But we still have at nighttime it's getting below 0 or below 32 for those in America, below freezing. So it is Canada, and they're predicting we're going to have a hard winter this year. So I like winter. So Keith from Northern England. Anything else about the Gurdjieff teachings you just want to add? It changed something awoke in you, didn't it? When you started to explore the teachings, and it's the magnetic center. When it grabs us and it locks onto these teachings, heaven help us. All other teachings, as far as I'm concerned, pale in comparison.
Brilliant.
Okay, I'm going to again be rushing through things. This is again where Keith is coming from. You can see the picture. It's on the seacoast. I've never been to Seaham, but I used to go to Whitby with my kids to the beach there a lot, and that's just sort of south of Seaham on the North Sea. I love England. I adore England. I don't really want to do a really lengthy inner exercise today because this is going to be an important meeting. And for last week, I apologize. I rushed through it because I wanted to get to a certain point. But to realize that our interest in these, this topic, our interest in these teachings it's not for ourselves, it's to transform ourselves so that we can be of higher service, not only to our fellow human beings, but also to the earth herself. And Mr. Gurdjieff's, vow, I wish to be, I can be, I have the right to be, I have the ability to be, I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit, but to help others. I wish to be to help others. And let me just close that. Stop sharing. So one of the mysteries of the Gurdjieff teachings is, what is the second conscious shock? And the second conscious shock is not something that can be readily explained. We can explain the first conscious shock fairly easily. And the first conscious shock is sensing our body, developing the sensation of self, becoming aware of our physical body as one organic whole, becoming aware of our whole body from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head, side to side, front to back, inside out. This is the most important preliminary step in the work, is the sensation of self. And some people need to spend years practicing this before they can summon it quickly and easily, and more metaphorically hold it in the back of our awareness. This is a precursor. It's a prerequisite for self-remembering. And this is not really found so much in the literature. It is in the literature, but it's not really brought to the central prominence it deserves in the literature. It's hinted at in some of the secondary sources, not in any of the primary sources, but some of Mr. Gurdjieff's students do talk about self-sensing and the sensation of self and the importance. This is the most basic inner exercise, to become aware of our physical body. So the sensation of self, it's a body-brain awareness. Self-remembering then involves a head-brain awareness combined with the body-brain awareness. So this is why we have to get so good at the body-brain awareness. We can hold it sort of in the back while we receive impressions through our eyes, our ears, our nose, and our taste buds. And not just receive impressions, but become aware of our eyes seeing, our ears hearing, our nose smelling, our taste buds tasting, while sensing our body. So Mr. Gurdjieff said that we have to practice the first conscious shock, that is self-remembering, for a long time, many, 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 many times. And scientists have said that, we have an ability to stay in the now for approximately 15 seconds. So if you lose this awareness fairly quickly, don't despair. It's just a matter of being present, conscious, and then trying to bring it back whenever you notice that you've lost it, and trying to hold on to it whenever you can. So it's like a muscle. It's something that has to be grown. It's something that has to be developed. It's something that we really need to work on. So there are a lot of exercises on the YouTube channel, the Gurdjieff Group of Toronto. I've got a number of exercises. And the exercises are like training wheels. They're all designed so that you can develop this awareness like this. Just be in your body. And it takes a lot of practice. And then to self-remember, to be aware of your eyes receiving impressions, your ears hearing impressions, receiving auditory impressions, your nose receiving olfactory impressions, and your taste buds receiving gustatory impressions, while sensing your body, is the first conscious shock. And as Mr. Gurdjieff said, we have to practice this for a long time. We're actually coding our inner body. We are leaving traces, crystallizations behind within us. And I've talked about this in other meetings. So we are actually growing an inner body every time we engage in self-remembering, and doing it in the proper form and sequence is essential. If we build that inner body, that inner house on the wrong foundations, it will not hold. And there's an entire chapter in Beelzebub Tales to his grandson called Form and Sequence, where Mr. Gurdjieff outlines the correct and proper form and sequence for doing this. So let me go to the notes that I'm going to be talking about today. So all of the quotes on this panel come from In Search of the Miraculous. The intellectual center works with hydrogen-48. The moving center with hydrogen-24. If the emotional center were to work with hydrogen-12, its work would be connected with the work of the higher emotional center. And this is found in chapter 9, and I'm going to be expanding and bringing in some other quotes today. But I want to pay particular attention to the fact that he does not define the lower, so to speak, emotional center. So just a second, whoops. I'm going to come over to the food diagrams. So let me expand this. And let me move it over. Oops. And get my annotation. So DO 48 is the energy of the intellectual center. La 24, it's also the energy of self-sensing, but it's also the energy of the moving center. I've talked before about the difference between when you first learned to drive a car, you did it with your intellectual center, you did it with hydrogen-48. So your movements were really slow, they were jerky, they were coming from your mind. But ultimately, you learn to drive with your moving center. And so, you know, if you drop a pencil and you grab it, that is the speed of your moving center. If you had to think about grabbing it, you wouldn't be able to catch it before it fell on the ground. So we can actually experiment in our lives. We can notice certain tasks that require an intellectual approach, notice the speed of those tasks, such as learning to drive a bicycle for the first time, learning to ride a bicycle, drive a car, even learning a language. When you first begin to learn the mouth sounds, you do it with your head brain. And after a while, the moving center takes over, because the speaking and pronunciation of language is a moving center phenomenon. So we can begin to look for these energies in our life. And if we can develop some kind of a base awareness, that recalling how it was when you first learned to drive a car as opposed to driving a car now, you will have an understanding of the difference in the speeds of these energies. So let me just go back to the quotes. If the emotional center were to work with hydrogen-12, its work would be connected with the higher emotional center. Coming back here, hydrogen-12 on the octave of air is up here. So up here This is the higher emotional center. It is fueled by hydrogen 12. It's on the octave of air, so we can speak about this particular molecule both as a reconciling element or reconciling force and as a denying force is the higher emotional center. And as I said, he did not give a number for the normal emotional work that we do with our being. I believe, it can vary from world 96, which, if we if we move over, world 96 is the level of invertebrates, and it's also the level of our moon. And these are the homicidal emotions, the road rage, the real dense, heavy, negative emotions where we are no longer present and we are the rage, the anger, the desire to kill. But we can also have very mechanical emotions. So that would be the level of 48. That would be emotions sort of with the density and heaviness of the speed of the mind. And then we can also have more mindful emotions. And when Mr. Gurdjieff talked about, conscious love, evokes the same emotional love. When he talks about the middle one of love, hope, and faith, the middle level, he's talking about the mindful level, and that is an emotional level. But the emotions, according to J.G. Bennett, on that level are very, very reactive. So you could love someone one moment and hate them the next. So, in those cases where the work of the emotional center reaches the intensity and speed of existence, which is given by hydrogen 12, I've got to, hydrogen 12, a temporary connection with the higher emotional center takes place. And man experiences new emotions, new impressions, hitherto entirely unknown to him, for the description of which he has neither words nor expressions. And this is because hydrogen 12, the realm of the sun, the realm of the awakened human being, the realm of consciousness, is above the level of words in our brain. Words are actually a fairly low part of our brain. They're not at that higher level. So it's really beyond words. We can only speak metaphorically. And it is said that the higher emotional center works with metaphors and symbols, not so much with words. But in ordinary conditions, the difference between the speed of our usual emotions and the speed of the higher emotional center is so great that no connection can take place, and we fail to hear within us the voices which are speaking and calling to us from the higher emotional center. So Mr. Gurdjieff said the higher emotional center is actually operational within us. It's working. We're just not able to access it and connect to it. The higher thinking center working with hydrogen 6 is still further removed from us, still less accessible. Connection with it is possible only through the higher emotional center. And and the reason this is so, let me come here. The higher emotional center has to act as the shock for me, and just close this so that, whoops, I guess I can't now take that. Let me, whoops. So Ba, he talked about Ba, or hydrogen 6, as being the higher intellectual. So this is the higher emotional, and this is the higher intellectual. And it requires the emotion to provide the shock at the me point that allows this octave to develop further. Let me get rid of those. So connection with it is possible only through the higher emotional center. We do not connect with the higher thinking center actually through the higher emotional center. It provides the shock necessary for me 12 of the octave of impressions to then move up to law 6, which is the higher emotional center. It is only from descriptions of mystical experiences, ecstatic states, and so on that we know cases of such connections. These states can occur on the basis of religious emotions. So real high emotions are short moments through particular narcotics. So there are substances, Mr. Gurdjieff in Beelzebub Tales to his grandson talked about the fact that there are substances on this planet that contain the energy of the earth, hydrogen-48. There are substances on this planet that contain the energy of the planetary system as their active element, hydrogen-48. There are substances on this planet that contain the energy of the sun, hydrogen-12, and there are substances on this planet that contain the energy of hydrogen-6. I don't want to go into this too much right now, but it is possible, and he talks about certain schools that use these substances to open people to higher awarenesses. So there are different ways we can enter them. And the final one is in certain pathological states, such as epileptic fits or accidental traumatic injuries to the brain, in which case it is difficult to say which is the cause and which is the effect. That is, whether the pathological states result from this connection or is the case. When I was 18, I was in a car accident down an embankment about 12 feet thudded into the earth. It must have taken a fraction of a second. It seemed like minutes. Time slowed down. So somehow that shock of the accident was able to elevate me into a higher state. So I was able to maintain a real deep awareness of something that I should have just happened, but it was just like in slow motion. If we could connect the centers of our ordinary consciousness with the higher thinking center deliberately and at will, it would be no use to us whatsoever in our present general state. In most cases where accidental contact with the higher thinking center takes place, a man becomes unconscious. The mind refuses to take in the flood of thoughts, emotions, images, and ideas which suddenly burst into it. And instead of a vivid thought or a vivid emotion, there results, on the contrary, a complete blank, a state of unconsciousness. The memory retains only the first moment when the flood rushed in on the mind and the last moment when the flood was receding and consciousness returned. But even these moments are so full of unusual shades and colors that there is nothing with which to compare them among the ordinary sensations of life. This is usually all that remains from so-called mystical and ecstatic experiences, which represent a temporary connection with a higher center. Only very seldom does it happen that a mind which has been better prepared succeeds in grasping and remembering something of what was felt and understood at the moment of ecstasy. But even in these cases, the thinking, the moving, and the emotional centers remember and transmit everything in their own way, translate absolutely new and never experienced sensations into the language of usual everyday sensations, transmit in worldly three-dimensional forms things which pass completely beyond the limits of worldly measurements. In this way, of course, they entirely distort every trace of what remains in the memory of these unusual experiences. In our ordinary centers, in transmitting the impressions of our ordinary centers, in the transmitting the impressions of the higher centers, may be compared to a blind man speaking of colors or a deaf man speaking of music. In order to obtain a correct and permanent connection between the lower and the higher centers, it is necessary to regulate and quicken the work of the lower centers. One way we regulate the work of the lower centers is through letting the mind do what the mind does, let the feelings do what the feelings do, let the body do what the body does, to not do wrong work with centers. Now, over the last few meetings, I've outlined a number of things that come from Chapter 9. I've put them all together in a list. So this is the way the human machine gets dirty. So it's like we are a car, and our brake pads and the places where the whatever it is and the brakes touch the wheels, they're just dirty, and the oil's dirty, and the gas tank is polluted, and the spark plugs aren't clean, and it's just a filthy machine. And so we've got to take the spark plugs out and wash them, and we've got to drain the oil and put new oil in, and we've got to clean all of the dirt in the machine. And so these are the ways the machine is dirty: unnecessary and unpleasant emotions, the expectation of unpleasant things, possible and impossible, bad moods, unnecessary haste, nervousness, worry, irritability, imagination, daydreaming, wrong work of centers, unnecessary tension of the muscles, perpetual chatter, interest continually taken in things happening around us or to other people and having in fact no interest whatsoever, constant waste of the force of attention, the expression of unpleasant sensations. Oh, this feels bad. Oh, my body hurts. And the like, restlessness. Those people who shake their legs constantly. The constantly moving flow of thoughts in our mind. That is the formatory apparatus. Continual change of moods, mood, feeling, and emotion. So these are the 17 different ways outlined in Chapter 9 of In Search of the Miraculous. So first we have to clean the machine. We have to, get all of the dirt and the grime and the incrustations in the machine off so that it works properly. And Mr. Gurdjieff said that we will release a tremendous amount of energy simply through the process of cleaning our machine. The second volitional shock and transmutation become physically possible only after long practice on the first volitional shock, which consists of self-remembering. This is something I mentioned just a few moments ago. If a man tries to remember himself, every impression he receives while remembering himself will, so to speak, be doubled. In an ordinary psychic state, I simply look at a street. But if I remember myself, I do not simply look at the street. And again, Uspensky translated this word wrong. I've retranslated it. I sense that I am looking. So the sensation of self, this awareness of my physical body as one organic whole. Instead of one impression of the street, there are two impressions. One of the street and another of myself looking at it. This second impression produced by the fact of my remembering myself is the additional shock. Coming back to the food diagrams, let me just move over. So we were actually talking about an awareness, an awareness here and an awareness here. to be mindful. The level of mindfulness is this realm. So the self-remembering can be said to be these two. The octave of impressions right here, this is the head brain like a positive note on a battery. The sensation of self, the awareness of our body in the background is like the negative diode on a battery. And he actually talks about this in Beelzebub Tales. Between the positive and the negative, the substance grows. So this is self-remembering. So now it very often happens that the additional sensation connected with self-remembering brings with it an element of emotion. That is, the work of a machine attracts a certain amount of carbon-12 to the place in question. So it can affect our emotions as well. When I was first taught to self-remember back in 1983, the very last thing I was taught to do was to breathe in the feeling of joy. And I was able to do it back then. People told me that or in 1981, I was told I shouldn't have been able to do it, but I did it. I was aware of what I saw, aware of my body, and I was able to breathe in that slightly higher element of emotion at the same time. That's not always possible. Sometimes you have to do a lot of work on yourself before you can get to that level. So here, efforts to remember oneself. One, observation of oneself at the moment of receiving an impression. That is the sensation of self, the awareness of our physical body. Two, the observation of one's impressions at the moment of receiving them. So La 24 of the octave of food and Re 24 of the octave of impressions. The two of those combined. And then 2B, registering, so to speak, the reception of impressions. So if you're walking down the street, you don't have to go, that's a sound. You know it's a sound, but you register that you're hearing it. A bird flies. You don't have to go, I'm seeing a bird fly, but you become aware that your eyes are seeing a bird flying. You smell, in Canada right now, we can smell leaves on the ground. There's a special smell of decaying leaves on the ground that have fallen off the trees in the fall. To be aware, to register that my nose is picking up these impressions through my head brain. So C, the simultaneous defining of the impressions received. And this is not a head brain labeling. It's a much quicker process. I'm seeing, but without the words, aware of the fact that I'm seeing that bird, aware of the fact that I'm smelling the decaying leaves. My nose is smelling the leaves, aware of the fact my hearing is hearing the sound of the traffic or whatever in the background. So all of this taken together doubles their intensity and carries Do 48 to Re 24. At the same time, the effort connected with the transition of one note to another and the passage of 48 itself to 24 enables Do 48 of the third octave, that is impressions, to come into contact with Mi 48 of the second octave. And then it goes through here, Mi 48 passes to Fa 24, Fa 24 passes to Sol 24, Sol 24 passes to La 6. La 6 is the highest matter produced by the organism from air. That is from the second kind of food. However, this is only obtained by making that impression. And it's even worse than that, because for most people, even self-remembering doesn't do it. So here, Do 48 then has the sufficient intensity. And actually, my diagram over on the left is slightly more accurate. If I can get over there. Whoops. And again, so I'm going to just stop sharing this briefly and come back, and this will give me control over it. So here, Mi 28, the octave of air just stops. It needs this power. And this also gives us a little bit of an understanding, because the gray is Mi 48 as the reconciling force, and the dark blue is Mi 48 as the denying force. So Do 48 acts on me 48 as the reconciling force, gives it enough energy to then move up. But for most people, it doesn't move up. It should, in some ways, lead to an awareness of the higher emotional center, but this doesn't happen. We have to practice self-remembering for a long time, and we've got to begin cleaning up the human machine through all of those lists, things that, I talked about, the 17 of them that I went through earlier. Whoops. I may have to just stop sharing this for a second in order to get rid of that. So, that's what's supposed to happen. Now, we all breathe the same air, and although the air inhaled by different people is exactly the same, the air exhaled is quite different. Some people exhale not 15, but only 10 elements. That is to say, they absorb 5 elements more. These 5 elements are higher hydrogens. These higher hydrogens are present in every small particle of air we inhale. By inhaling air, we introduce these higher hydrogens into ourselves. But if our organism does not know how to extract them out of the particles of air and retain them, they are exhaled back into the air. We come again to the old alchemical law. In order to make gold, it is first of all necessary to have a certain quantity of real gold. If no gold whatsoever is possessed, there is no means of making it. So coming back to the food diagrams, the carbons that have to be present for higher are carbon is when all of these things are the carbons. They're necessary even down here. Down here, food comes into our mouth. It meets with the saliva, which is the higher carbon. It's the Ray 24 is refined out of it. It meets with the gastric juices present in our stomach, which is the higher carbon. This is found in Beelzebub Tales. It then goes into our duodenum. It meets with the higher carbon in our duodenum. And at this point, it comes to a stop, and it requires, at this point, it comes to a stop, and it requires the octave of air to come into the process, and then it proceeds. Fa is refined in the liver, Fa 96. So 48 is refined in the 2 cerebral hemispheres. La 24 is refined in the cerebellum, and C12 in the testes and ovaries. So for the octave, both the octave of impressions and the octave of air to move up, we need to somehow bring higher carbons into ourselves. We need to be able to extract these carbons to somehow have them. And that is what Mr. Gurdjieff is talking about in this passage. And here again, coming back to what has happened within the Gurdjieff movement. The Gurdjieff movement is dying. The average age of lineage groups is roughly my age. I'm 62, so somewhere in that realm. They've hidden a lot of this away. But I have an exercise on the YouTube channel. It's on the playlist. There will be a link on Facebook where you can go to those exercises. There will be a link posted on YouTube, and it's called the morning sitting. By breathing with the 3-brained awareness, following that exercise, which I got from George Adi. I didn't, and he was a student of Mr. Gurdjieff. It was a recording that was made in the late 90s. I didn't want to infringe on copyright, so I rewrote it and re-recorded it in my own voice using my own script. but that is how we extract higher particles, these higher hydrogens, these higher carbons into our self that allows us to then do this work. So we not only have to clean our machine to make sure it's working properly, we also have to have these higher substances present within ourselves in order to have this alchemical process going on. And the main way we do this is through that breathing exercise. Breathing involving the head brain, breathing involving the body brain, and breathing involving the feeling brain. Unfortunately, a lot of people are still not able to become aware and differentiate feeling from sensation. They're not able to feel feeling in their body. It's easiest and most often felt in the hands and fingers. And I've done meetings where I've gone through that. Maybe I'll begin the next meeting with that. So feeling is a different quality. And then as we breathe, we feel feeling go to our solar plexus, breathing in. And as we breathe out, we feel it going down to our reproductive organs. And through this process, we bring these higher carbons necessary for those advanced alchemical processes of the higher to blend with the lower and meet in the middle. All that has been said before about work on oneself, about the formation of inner unity. I've highlighted that inner unity, the multiplicity of eyes, getting a chief steward. This is all in search of the miraculous, really trying to develop that unity of being. And the transition from the level of man number 1, number 2, and number 3 to the level of man number 4 and further pursues one and the same aim. What is called, according to one terminology, the astral body, is called in another terminology of these teachings, the higher emotional center, and also in these teachings, the Gurdjieff body. Although the difference here does not lie in the terminology alone, these are, to speak more correctly, different aspects of the next stage of man's evolution. This is the result of the second conscious shock. So the result of the first conscious shock, self-remembering creates what's on the left, and he's speaking about the results of the second conscious shock, creating on the right. But he's also speaking right now about the development of the higher emotional center, the Gurdjieff body, which we can talk about this kind of being the Gurdjieff body. And then over here on the right, the higher being body, for those who've read it, Beelzebub Tales to His Grandson, or the soul body, or however we want to talk about it. So it can be said that the astral body is necessary for the complete and proper functioning of the higher emotional center in unison with the lower, or it can be said that the higher emotional center is necessary for the work of the astral body. Here, he hadn't introduced the term Gurdjieff body. He didn't like the term astral body. This was, approximately 1915 to 1917 when he was talking to Uspensky in Russia. Later on, he came up with the term Gurdjieff body. So he's basically saying that, in order for us to have a Gurdjieff body and for it to proper and completely function, it needs the higher emotional center. But the higher emotional center needs the Gurdjieff body to be the container in order for it to function. So the higher emotional body and the Gurdjieff body are both inextricably linked together. For the 2 octaves to develop further, a second conscious shock is needed at a certain point in the machine, and this effort is connected with the emotional life. In other words, it starts with the octave of air. That is a special kind of influence over one's emotions. So this is actually a sequence of events. The practice of not expressing unpleasant emotions, of not identifying, of not considering inwardly, is the preparation for the second effort. So we can break this down into steps. Normally we get upset and we go, and we express it, if not in our voice, we express it on our face and the muscles of our body. Maybe we just kind of slump or whatever. So the first step is to just stop doing that. We don't and can't stop the negative emotions. All we can do at the beginning is to work on the non-expression of them. And the non-expression of them is not just verbal expression, but also the expression, our body posture, our body language, and then of not identifying. Now, there's a step here, there's a step in here that's not really brought out. The first step is really disidentifying. And the second one is non-identifying. Disidentifying is the body, we still have that emotional reaction within, we're still aware of that emotional reaction, but we just don't express it and we don't allow ourselves to be pulled into that emotion, that is, to identify with that emotion. But earlier in In Search of the Miraculous, Mr. Gurdjieff talked about the different bodies that we can have. And for a normal man, control is at the lowest body. And as we move up, the control shifts to higher bodies. And there is a point where we begin to awaken something within us. At first, it's tiny and almost unheard, but it is the real I. And eventually, we move from the non-expression of emotion to disidentifying with those emotions, to controlling ourselves from within, and that non-identification of the emotions, where we know that, it's the body that may be expressing and feeling these emotions, or the feeling circuits, or the thoughts, but we are not our body, we are not our thoughts, we are not our feelings, they are our instruments. And a subsection of identifying is considering inwardly, internal considering. Oh, why did it have to rain on me? All of these. So we first start by not expressing them. Then secondly, we disidentify from them. And third, we move into that state of non-identification, that deeper, more inward state within us. And these are considered the preparation for the second effort. Now, coming back to the food diagrams. Where are my controls there? So, hydrogen 24. Just try and move this over. Whoops. I don't know if I can get rid of that now. I'll just stop sharing and come back. Hydrogen 24, the planetary realm, it's the true realm of man. So over here, Mr. Gurdjieff said this is the natural realm of man. St. Paul also said this. He had carnal man, natural man, and spiritual man. Over here, this would be carnal man, sleeping man in St. Paul, natural man, which I've listed as mindful man, and awakened man. So the mindful realm. And then let me get rid of those, or they'll stay on my screen. And when we come over here, we can see it's the planetary realm. So this is something I talk about many times. In order to be mindful of my hand, in order to sense my hands and be aware of my hands, I actually have to inwardly detach from my hands. Every act of mindful awareness, whether it's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, The awareness of our body involves this inward detachment. Mr. Gurdjieff said it is the separation of the self from the self. So every act of mindfulness involves a moving inward. If we understand the vast distance between the planets in the planetary realm and compare the planetary realm to the earthly realm, if we compare what it's like to be in a complete state of identification with our body and then to become mindful of our body, or even just mindful of our hands, we can begin to get an understanding of the energy of the planetary realm and the energy of this mindful realm. So every act of mindful awareness, the mindful awareness of my body breathing, the sensation of air flowing in and out, the movement of the muscles, requires this inward separation. At first, it's like shining a flashlight on our hand, and we're aware of our hand, we're really mindful of our hand. But ultimately, where is that flashlight coming from? Within the sensation of our hands, the actual flashlight, the cause of it is coming from C12 of the octave of food. This is sensation. C12 is involved in every act of mindful self-sensing, every act of sensation of self. C12 is on the level of the awake man. It's on the level of the solar realm. It's on the level of the angels using the diagram of all living things. But ultimately, where is that coming from? It's coming from the real I. So every act of mindful awareness involves us tapping into this level. So the non-identification, a state of non-identification is an inward state where we are no longer identified with our thoughts. We're aware that it thinks. We are no longer identified with our body. We are aware that it senses, and we are no longer identified with our feelings. We are aware of it feeling. And a number of meetings ago, not too far the past, I talked about identification and go into more detail in that one. So the next one comes from George Gurdjieff, Views from the Real World. If you remember the example I gave you of identification, you will see how blind a man is when he identifies with his moods, feelings, and thoughts. In other words, he is not present. And when we're talking about he is not present, it's the first awakenings of the real I, that deeper, more fundamental aspect of our being that we awaken and slowly coax out through the process of non-identification. So the next one, C.S. Knott's, the pupil's journey. Identification occurs when our energy and attention is fixed on one aspect of a thing. It is one-centered work, a form of hypnosis. So whenever we are no longer in the picture, whenever we are not mindful, we are in a state of identification by definition. 97% of humanity, and I'm just pulling that figure out of my head, but it's real close, live, die, and rarely step out of that state of identification. They are in the state of identification, all the time, walking down the street, driving their car. It's only when we begin to move inwards, the separation of the self from the self, to step into that state of non-identification, that we are not identifying. And Mr. Gurdjieff says that we start to develop our real individuality at that point. Paris wartime meetings. Gurdjieff, well, you haven't understood the task I gave you. I told you to learn to prepare yourself to play a role exterior, a role an interior, not to identify yourself. So this is a practical technique. This is an inner exercise here we can all practice in our life. If you're a doctor, pretend that you're being a doctor and you're playing the role of a doctor. If you are a lawyer, you should pretend you're playing the role of a lawyer, because you are not really a doctor or a lawyer. Whatever you do, exterior, you should pretend to play a role and not identify with yourself. So this is a profound inner exercise here. Interior, you do the work given here. Exterior, you change nothing. You should be as before. Before you were doing like that, now you do the same. Play a role without anyone noticing that something is going on in you. Change nothing. You remain as you were before, but you play a role. Well then, you will understand what it is to play a role. You will do the same thing you did 6 months ago. You change only the interior. So this is a profound inner exercise we can practice in life. We can play the role of ourself with our family, with our fellow employees, with people in the coffee shop, or whatever. This is a way, a practical technique to not identify. From In Search of the Miraculous. Only a person who is completely normal as regards sex has any chance in the work. Any kind of originality, strange taste, strange desires, or on the other hand, fears, constantly working buffers must be destroyed from the very beginning. A month or so ago, I think going back to September, I did meetings on the misuse of sexual energy. So we not only have to, this is part of cleaning our being. We've got to clean and make sure that C12 is used properly. We must, and 5, the constantly working buffers must be destroyed from the very beginning. Modern education and modern life creates an enormous number of sexual psychopaths. They have no chance in the work. This is the abuse of sex. It is necessary further to remember that the sex center works with hydrogen-12. That is, it's on the level of the sun. It is the center of gravity of the psychic life of the awakened human being on that solar level. This means that it is stronger and quicker than all the other centers. Sex, in fact, governs all the other centers. Hey, Angelica, I noticed you joined us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. The only thing in ordinary circumstances, that is, when a man has neither consciousness nor will that holds the sex center in submission, is buffers. And, a month ago or whatever, you'd have to look through the meetings. I did some meetings on buffers. Buffers can entirely bring it to naught. That is, they can stop its normal manifestation. And buffers are the things that say, oh, you can just have a drink, or oh, have that cigarette. Buffers are artificial appliances that bring us down. So the energy remains and passes over to other centers, finding the expression for itself through them. So other centers working with the energy of the sexual center. It muddies the machine, dirties the machine. So this is all part of cleaning the machine, which will allow us to awaken the higher emotional center, which will then create the second conscious shock. And I'll just talk about that in a minute. In other words, the other centers rob the sex center of the energy which it does not use itself. And that energy should be used for this self-sensing and the awareness of our physical body. The energy of the sex center in the work of the thinking, emotional, and moving centers can be recognized by a particular taste, a particular fervor, by a vehemence which the nature of the affair is not called from. From In Search of the Miraculous. There stand behind you many years of wrong and stupid life. 1, indulgence in every kind of weakness. Oh, I'll just have that ice cream. Oh, I'll just watch that TV program or whatever. I'll just have that drink. I'll just have that cigarette. This is dirtying the machine. 2, shutting your eyes to your own errors. This willful blindness, not willful, but just blindness, to avoid all unpleasant truths, constantly lying to yourself, of self-justification, of blaming others. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are 7 different aspects of buffers. So buffers, oh, come on, have that drink, have that cigarette, indulge in any kind of weakness. 2, shutting your eyes to your own error. Oh, I'm such a loving person. Damn you, I hate you, you get it. Oh, I'm such a loving person. And we we avoid, we just have these blinders on and we don't see how horrible we really are. Avoiding all unpleasant truths. So we don't want to see these unpleasant truths in ourselves, perhaps people around us. Constantly lying to yourselves. We do this all the time, lying to ourselves. We think we know things that we can't possibly know. We talk about politics and presidents and prime ministers as if we had a PhD in political science with such authority, and yet we just absorb those opinions from the world. How are you doing? I'm fine when you're hurting inside and whatever. So much lying and self-justification and blaming others. I call buffers the self-justifiers. Oh, have that drink, have that cigarette. Oh, you're tired. Oh, just watch that TV show. Oh, you can work tomorrow. These are all things that just, they're little sort of rote thoughts. We think that they're ourselves, but they're just these little tiny voices that are so mechanical. Oh, have a drink, have a smoke. You don't have to work today. Oh, you've had a hard day. You can just relax. All this cannot help affecting the machine. The machine is dirty. In places it is rusty, and in some places artificial appliances have been formed. The necessity for which has been created by its own wrong way of working. So the machine is dirty. We talked about cleaning it, rusty, cleaning it. And this one, the artificial appliances. These artificial appliances will now interfere very much with all your good intentions. They are called buffers. Buffers are created slowly and gradually. Very many buffers are created artificially through education. Others are created under the hypnotic influence of all surrounding life. Our mother saying, "What do you say?" when we're a little kid. "Thank you." We're being insincere and we're taught insincerity and we're taught to lie. We're taught to hide the truth about ourselves from other people or they will squash us down. And we create buffers. A man is surrounded by people who live, speak, think, and feel by means of buffers. Imitating them in their opinions, actions, and words, a man involuntarily creates similar buffers in himself. Buffers make a man's life more easy. It is very hard to live without buffers. They're things that keep us asleep and prevent us from awakening so that we enjoy our sleep. We're in a prison cage and we've decorated our prison cage and gilded it and made it look so good that we're not even aware any longer we're in this prison. But they keep man from the possibility of inner development because buffers are made to lessen shocks, and it is only shocks that can lead a man out of the state in which he lives, that is, waken him. Buffers lull a man to sleep, give him the agreeable and peaceful sensation that all will be well, that no contradictions exist, and that he can sleep in peace. Buffers are appliances by means of which a man can always be in the right. Buffers help a man not to feel his conscience. And conscience is absolutely instrumental. Understanding the nature of conscience, understanding remorse of conscience, and I've done meetings on that in the past, absolutely essential for the preparation of the second conscious shock. Buffers help a man not to feel his conscience. So from Paris wartime meetings, are your parents still alive? The answer was no. We have not known them, but perhaps they had souls, perhaps they suffered. They cannot do any more where they are. They have no body. You must do something for them. And this something is remorse of conscience. You must think of them. You must picture them to yourself. See them again. Have their faces before your eyes. You must think of all that you owe them. You are a small piece of them, of their life. You must love them. Express your gratitude to them. And he's talking to a man whose parents are dead. Think back on all they have done for you. You must see your mistakes towards them. Persist in this. Reconstruct the scenes when you have made them suffer, perhaps cry. Relive the times when you were a bad child. You must have remorse of conscience. Remorse. One must suffer voluntarily to repair. One must pay for the past. The past must be repaired. And here he's actually giving very concrete examples and ways to practice remorse of conscience. It can get even a little bit more complex. Go back to a time when you were really mean to your parents and imagine you're your parents and feeling the feelings of hurt you caused them, feeling the pain and the suffering you caused them, experiencing the torment you caused them from their position is another profound exercise in remorse of conscience. In Beelzebub Tales, Mr. Gurdjieff makes it clear, at least to me, because I'm a professional hypnotherapist, the easiest way to experience remorse of conscience is through hypnosis. It's one of the underlying themes of that book. Unless, though, you are a professional hypnotherapist, you might miss it. One must pay for the past. The past must be repaired. Again, from Paris Wartime Meetings, what you lack is remorse of conscience. You do not think of that. Have you children? Yes. How many? 3. 3! Well, if you have 3 children, you should know that your life doesn't exist anymore for yourself, but for your children. It is for your children that you do everything, or for your, is it for your children that you do everything or for your own satisfaction? Ask yourself. If you have asked yourself that, I can tell you that if you have no remorse of conscience towards your children, that can serve as a reminding factor to make you work in order for you to become a real man. You have no right to your own satisfactions. That is finished. Everything is for your children, everything that you have for possibilities. It is an objective necessity, but you do not think of it. You continue to act as an egotist. Your question proves it. So have remorse of conscience for the future. Repair the past for the sake of the future. You are obliged to work for your children. This idea held in you can play the role of a factor at times for remembering yourself, at times for giving you strength for the future. And with it, you will be able to repair the past. And I should just point out here, it's obvious he's talking to someone who still has small children at home. If, like me, your children are all grown and they're in their late 20s and whatever, it's a different story. But when you are responsible for them, your ego should step out and you should think of all of those times. Even if you're like a parent like me with grown children, you should think of those times you weren't the best parent. Bring the remorse of conscience to those memories in the past, heal those memories, repair the past. From the sayings of George Gurdjieff, compiled by Kenneth Walker. From the time when man began to live on earth, from the time of Adam onwards, there started to be formed within him, with the help of God, of nature, of all of his surroundings, an organ whose function is conscience. Every man has this organ, and whoever is guided by it automatically lives according to God's commandments. If our consciences were not clear, if our consciences were clear and not buried, there would be no need to speak about morality, for consciously or unconsciously, everyone would behave according to God's commandments. Unfortunately, conscience is covered up with a kind of crust which can be pierced only by intense suffering. Then conscience speaks. But after a while, a man calms down once more, and once more the organ becomes covered over and buried. This is really important. Conscience gets covered up with the crust, which can be pierced only by intense suffering, and specifically remorse of conscience. That is, that's how we deal with it. From In Search of the Miraculous, and here is the key, the code to understanding what he said there. We have two more centers fully developed and properly functioning, but they are not connected with our usual life. The existence of these higher centers in us is a greater riddle than the hidden treasures which men who believe in the existence of the mysterious and the miraculous have sought since remote times. This present teaching differs from many others by the fact that it affirms that the higher centers exist in man and are fully developed. It is the lower centers that are undeveloped, and it is precisely this lack of development or the incomplete functioning of the lower centers that prevents us from making use of the work of the higher centers. As has been said earlier, there are two higher centers, the higher emotional center working with hydrogen 12 and the higher thinking center working with hydrogen 6. So coming back to the Kenneth Walker Gurdjieff sayings, conscience is covered up with a kind of crust which can be pierced only by intense suffering. Then conscience speaks. And he talks about the fact that the higher centers exist in man. The key here is conscience is part of the higher emotional center. Awakening conscience awakens the higher emotional center. Piercing the crustaceans and the, whatever that's grown around conscience is the work of remorse of conscience. And I actually edited this slightly, but this was an answer to something I said to Hisham earlier on Facebook today, and I thought I would say it because it brings it out. Conscience is a quality or attribute of the higher emotional center. These are my words. Remorse of conscience is actually a power we can wield to repair the past. And as we repair the past, we clean away all of the debris and incrustations that block conscience and the higher emotional center from coming online. Mr. Gurdjieff said that conscience is the only sacred being impulse that we have access to, and we, alcohol and stuff are self-calming way of pushing it away. So here I state remorse of conscience is different than conscience. Remorse of conscience is like blowing away the dust and crust that has grown up around conscience. And ultimately, you must learn to wield this consciously and not allow it to be triggered by something so mechanical as an illness. Hisham was actually saying there were times he liked getting ill because it made him feel remorse. And my response was that we've got to really learn to consciously and deliberately use remorse of conscience to go back and repair our past, not to allow this bad feeling we're having now in our body to do that. I mean, we can begin that way. That can begin a good preliminary step, but it's something we have to do volitionally, intentionally, with full awareness. Oh, there. Let me just come back. There's one more diagram I want to share. The second conscious shock. So we have a filthy machine. It's dirty in places. It's rusted in places. We may have hooked up to the battery a reading light in the car, and we're draining the battery and doing the wrong work of what the battery is. And, we may be dragging something behind us to do something. And these sort of, are metaphors of the wrong work of centers. All of those 17 things that I listed earlier that will be in these meeting notes are part of this process of the second conscious shock. We know what the first conscious shock is, but we have to clean and repair the machine. And we clean the machine by not negative emotions and identification intoxication and, that whole list, unexcessive movements, chattering, whatever, wrong work of centers. We clean that machine, and then it is absolutely necessary for us to learn to work with remorse of conscience. And remorse of conscience allows us to begin to activate the sacred being impulse of conscience, which is within us but buried. And awakening conscience. Conscience is a part of the higher emotional center. I'm not sure where my controls are. Whoops. Here they are. So conscience, the higher emotional center, are both hydrogen 12, so the level of our sun, the level of the awakened being, the level of the angels, to use Mr. Gurdjieff's diagram of all living things that is towards the end of In Search of the Miraculous. So the second conscious shock has to be triggered by the awakening of conscience, by the awakening and bringing online the higher emotional center. This then provides the necessary shock for me 12 of the octave of impressions to then continue upwards, and the higher intellectual center is Fa 6. I mentioned that earlier. And then this effect on me 12 has the same energy and resonance necessary to cause this shock here of C12 and the further movement of the octave of food up. So the second conscious shock, Mr. Gurdjieff said it's more difficult, but it's all contained within the teachings. It's all here. Cleaning the machine, writing the machine, balancing the machine, getting everything to work properly, the wrong work or the right work of centers, getting rid of all of those dirty stuffs. One of the biggest impediments to conscience is the development of buffers, those artificial appliances. So beginning to work with the buffers, eliminating them one by one. If you smoke, stop smoking. You will see those dogs, those buffers spring into high gear. Oh, you deserve it. Oh, it's been a long time. Oh, you need a break. Any kind of addictive behavior, those dogs Mr. Gurdjieff talked about, are great examples for observing our buffers. But even if you don't have those, oh, I should be working now, but I just don't want to do it, or I've had a long day, I should take it easy. It's all of those little snippets, those almost rote recordings in our voice that sound like it's coming from us, but they're all trying to suppress conscience. They're trying to steal the energy of conscience. So working on buffers is very important, and working with remorse of conscience. And remorse of conscience, there's a two-step process. Step one, or part of it, is the remorse we feel in our head brain. If you've done something wrong, the thoughts, oh boy, I hurt them, whatever. And then there's the organic shame we experience in our body brain. The organic shame that a little child experiences, where the face goes red and their eyes get teary, and it's bringing the head brain, oh God, I was really bad, I shouldn't have said that, together with the body brain organic shame. And between those two polarities, another substance grows, another possibility grows, and that possibility is remorse of conscience. And then we use remorse of conscience to repair the past. And in other words, we use the power of remorse of conscience. We consciously wield it to break away those incrustations that have developed around conscience, like the ash over the glowing ember of a fire, so we can't see the glowing ember. We've got to blow the ash away to reveal the glowing ember, to reveal conscience, and we do that through remorse of conscience. So awakening conscience, awakening the higher emotional center, doing all of that cleaning work, practicing self-remembering over and over and over and over again in the proper form and sequence. These are all necessary. And when this is done properly, it then gives So 12 of the octave of air the sufficient energy and valence necessary to provide the shock to Me 12 of the octave of impressions. And then that gives Me 12 of the octave of impressions enough energy to act as the shock for C12 of the food octave. And then we grow this part of our being. And let me just, oops, I might not be able to get rid of that unless I just stop the sharing. And so we come back to the food diagrams and we see this is the growth of the Kesdjan body. So this is a man with a Kesdjan body, a human, a person, man or woman. This is on the right, the final development. This is the diagram of the awakened human being. The first conscious shock, self-remembering done in the proper form and sequence, leads to the left side development. And then the cleansing of the machine, the removing of the buffers, the working with remorse of conscience, that moving inwards into a state of non-identification, all blow away the incrustations that have grown up around conscience and awaken conscience, which is an integral part of the higher emotional center, which allows this further growth to occur. And I've got 8 minutes left. These last 3 meetings have just been packed with a lot of information. And I've had to rush through it. Fortunately, they will be on YouTube. You will be able to go and watch them over and over again. And I figured out, I sort of knew how, but I had to, last Sunday, I spent 6 hours figuring out how to update my website. And so I'm going to be putting my meeting notes as a PDF on the website and giving the link when I post the video on YouTube so that people will actually be able to download the notes that I showed today. And hopefully whenever I show notes, I'll be able to do that in the future so that anyone from YouTube or Facebook or whatever will have access to these notes and can go over and read them themselves, ponder them, perhaps go back to the source material. But so the first conscious shock, self-remembering, and the second conscious shock. This, like I said before, this is why Mr. Gurdjieff did not invent his system. This system, he was taught. He may have found something over here that plugged into the system and found something that plugged into the system, but he talks about that in Beelzebub Tales and in Search of the Miraculous, how knowledge was divided amongst different groups, and India was philosophy, and Egypt was practice, and Central Asia was theory. So you can go to these other places, and you know, he found parts that plugged in, but he did not make this system up. This was not his invention. This is an ancient science that goes back. It's probably the civilization that created Egypt, maybe even the civilization that created Göbekli Tepe. This is an ancient awareness. I'm hearing a weird sound. Just trying to. Does anyone have any questions? We're just like 5 minutes. I really, you know, strove to get through it quickly. 3 very important meetings where I go to stuff that no one in the foundation will ever talk about, probably because they don't even know this. They haven't put it all together. But they certainly, if you ask them about it, they will certainly behave in a bit of a condescending fashion and say, oh, well, we don't speak about that. And, you know, the lineage groups try to hide this all away. one of my goals is to share this with people who are interested in the teachings, to preserve these teachings, because the average age of members within lineage groups such as the Gurdjieff Bennett and Foundation is around 60, 65. Young people are not interested in these teachings. They're not. They go and join those groups and they spend 3 or 4 weeks in them, and they're squelched and stopped, and told it's going to take years, and their questions aren't answered. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to share my knowledge, to share my understanding, things that I've gained over 38 years now, 38 and a half years of working on myself. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've got a lot of things right. And it's all there in the literature. It's just a matter of understanding what was told and piecing it all together. Any questions? Now, just a second, Keith. It looks like you're talking and your microphone's muted. Okay, you can talk now, Keith.
We talk food there, physical food. What quality food should we consume for our awareness?
Can you say?
What type of physical foods should be consumed?
I mean, I don't like to give away too much about tales. You only get a first. You don't get a second chance to receive a first impression. But Mr. Gurdjieff was very big on cooking. He opened restaurants, sold them. He was an incredible cook, and he believed in eating foods that contained their active element. So as fresh a food as we can, as organic a food as we can. He talked about a deterioration in humanity as a result of canned foods and stuff like that. It's a huge section in Beelzebub Tales where he talks about it. And he also talks about it with his students, the ladies of the rope, Catherine Hulme, the use and proper use of foods, and foods as fresh, containing what he called the active elements. You don't want foods that are dead, that are inert, that are lifeless. The difference between white flour and whole wheat flour is that all the goodness has been removed from white flour, the vitamins, minerals, and whatever. And this wasn't done to remove the good qualities. By removing them, it almost doubled the shelf life of bread, so they could keep it in the store longer and make a better profit from it. So to eat more plant-based, to eat better. Angelica is probably more of an expert on this because she actually makes organic vegan food for Tibetan lamas who are living near where she lives in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And so she's a vegan chef and cooking. Now, Mr. Gurdjieff ate meat, but he preferred to choose his meat. He hated slaughterhouses and the process that they did. But he did say vegetarianism was a better option, and he recommended that we follow the old Orthodox calendar and refrain from eating meat or any animal products for 3 periods in the year. The main one being Lent, another one 2 weeks in August, and then the 4 weeks before Advent. Basically, to be vegan for 1/3 of the year. And there are substances that are contained in meat and eggs and milk that will then be flushed out of our system, that will help us to live longer. So through not necessarily becoming vegan, but avoiding all animal products for those specific times of the year, this is also something that's entails. I go vegan for Lent every year. It's a way of eating more wholesome food. Okay, these are 3 big meetings, with a lot of information in them. We're out of time. It's my computer says 11:59. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, as soon as I upload the YouTube version, I'll take the Facebook version down. I'll provide a link for the meeting notes that in PDF form that you'll be able to download exactly as they appeared on the screen with the colors and highlights and everything, whatever. And so those of you who are watching on Facebook, I'd like to thank you for having joined us today. Those of you who will be watching later on YouTube, thank you. And for those of you who actually made it, Keith, Karen, Angelica, Brian, and Hisham, understand he's listening. I would like to thank you for being here. And next week, same time, I'm not sure what I'll talk about. I may just do a bunch of inner exercises and just do a free flow. And just, you know, these have been a couple of real intense months of teaching and going through specific aspects from buffers to identification, the misuse of C12, considering the first conscious shock, the second conscious shock, a lot of information that we've been covering in the fall. But thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here, those of you on the screen, and enjoy the rest of your day. And till next week. Bye now.
Thank you, Allan.
Thanks, Allan.